Win this and I'll give you 100 millers, veteran laughed. Maid's daughter did. His face went pale. The marble floors of the Thorne estate gleamed under the chandeliers, every surface polished to reflect wealth and authority. Servants moved quietly, their eyes lowered, carrying trays of wine and silver. At the head of the long oak table sat Elias Thorne, war hero, market tycoon, and master of the house. His voice carried across the hall, gruff with age, yet sharp with pride. "You should be grateful I keep you here," he sneered toward Susan Miller, his maid of many years. "Without me, where would you be? Scrubbing dishes for scraps?" Laughter rumbled from the guests around him, each eager to echo their host's cruelty. Susan lowered her gaze, her cheeks burning with humiliation. But before she could respond, a small figure stepped forward from the shadow of the hall. It was her daughter, Abigail, 9 years old, hair tied back with a ribbon too worn to match the room's luxury, eyes steady as flint. She looked directly at Elias Thorne, unafraid. "If you think you're so clever," she said, her voice clear enough to silence the laughter, "play me in chess." The room stilled. A child challenging a man whose reputation for strategy had once commanded soldiers and conquered markets? Ridiculous. Guests exchanged smirks. Elias chuckled darkly, leaning back in his chair. "You?" he drawled. "A little maid's daughter dares to challenge me? Very well, let's make it interesting." He tapped his cane on the floor, his eyes glittering with arrogance. "If you win, I'll give you $100 million. But if you lose, your mother walks out of this house tonight. Forever." Gasps rippled through the room. Susan clutched her daughter's arm in horror. "Abby, no," she whispered. But the girl did not flinch. She nodded once, calm as though the outcome had already been written. Elias barked for the servants to bring the chess set, his voice dripping with mockery. "Come then, little one. Show us what you've got. Let the world see how a pauper's child is crushed under a king's hand." The pieces were set, the stakes unimaginable. And in that glittering hall, no one knew the truth. Abigail had inherited more than courage. She had inherited her grandfather's wisdom, a legacy of patience, sacrifice, and a mastery of the game that would soon turn Elias Thorne's arrogance into his undoing. The Thorne estate was a fortress of wealth. Built on a hill overlooking the city, it sprawled across acres of manicured gardens, fountains, and marble terraces. Inside, the grand hall where the challenge took place looked like a museum of power. Oil portraits of generals and bankers hung on the walls, chandeliers dripped with crystal, and the heavy scent of cigar smoke clung to the air. Every detail screamed authority and intimidation. At the center of it all was Elias Thorne. In his late 70s, he still carried himself with the bearing of the soldier he once was. His shoulders were broad, though bent with age, his silver hair combed neatly, and his dark suit cut from the finest fabric. A jagged scar ran down his jawline, a souvenir from a battlefield decades earlier. To the world, he was the very picture of triumph, a decorated veteran who had turned wartime cunning into an empire of investments. Yet beneath the medals and money lay something darker, a man who mistook cruelty for strength, whose victories had hardened into arrogance. The room was filled with his kind of people, financiers, retired officers, and politicians, all eager to orbit his wealth. They laughed when he laughed, sneered when he sneered, and looked away when his words cut deep. To them, tonight was another show of dominance, another reminder that Elias Thorne commanded not just fortunes, but fate's. Susan Miller, in contrast, looked as though she had stumbled into the wrong world. At 40, she was worn by years of service, hands rough from scrubbing, back bent from labor. She moved quietly, speaking little, always careful not to draw attention. The guests barely registered her existence, except as a target for Thorne's ridicule. But those who looked closely could see her strength, the resilience of a woman who had endured humiliation yet never abandoned dignity. And then there was Abigail. Just 9 years old, she was small for her age, dressed in a plain cotton dress her mother had mended twice. But her eyes, bright, steady, unblinking, were her grandfather Frank Miller's eyes. Frank had been a small-town shop owner with a love for chess, the kind of man who saw strategy in everyday life. Before his death, he had taught Abigail the game with patience and passion. "Chess is life, Abby," he would say. "It's not about the queen or the king, it's about the pawns, ordinary pieces with the power to change everything if they endure." Abigail had absorbed every word. She practiced on a worn wooden board, replaying her grandfather's games, memorizing his lessons on patience, sacrifice, and foresight. Where other children saw toys, she saw battlefields. Her moves were not flashy, but deliberate, shaped by an understanding far beyond her years. She knew, though she didn't fully understand, that Frank's business had been destroyed years ago by deals linked to Elias Thorne. She had overheard fragments of adult conversations, whispers of injustice, and felt in her bones that tonight was more than a game. It was her chance to stand where her grandfather never could. The chessboard was brought in, an heirloom carved from ivory and ebony, pieces polished to a shine. It was set on a low table in the center of the hall. Guests gathered in a circle, their curiosity piqued. The idea of a child challenging Elias Thorne was absurd, laughable entertainment. But beneath the smirks, there was tension. What if the impossible happened? Elias sat first, lowering himself with the authority of a general taking command. "White, of course," he said, claiming the first move without question. He looked at Abigail as one might look at an insect, amused but ready to crush. Abigail climbed onto the opposite chair. Her feet dangled above the floor, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She stared at the board, unbothered by the laughter, unshaken by the stakes. To her, this was not about money or humiliation. It was about proving that even the smallest pawn could reach the other side. Susan stood frozen behind her daughter, torn between fear and pride. She wanted to snatch Abigail away, but she also knew this spark, this courage, was Frank's gift. And deep down, she felt that stopping her would mean extinguishing something greater than fear. The stage was set. Around them, the hall glittered with wealth and arrogance. On one side, Elias Thorne, veteran, billionaire, master of markets. On the other, Abigail Miller, 9 years old, Maid's daughter, armed with nothing but her grandfather's wisdom. And the first move was about to be played. Elias Thorne leaned forward, his scarred jawline catching the light of the chandelier, and with a smirk, he slid his king's pawn 2 spaces forward. The move was aggressive, commanding. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. It was the kind of opening move one expected from a man who had spent his life marching into battles head-on. Abigail studied the board quietly. She didn't fidget. She didn't glance around the room to see the mocking smiles or hear the whispers. Her small hand reached out, calm and steady, and advanced her own pawn. The game had begun. The guests exchanged amused glances. "Look at her," one man chuckled. "She thinks this is child's play." Another whispered, "She'll be done in 10 moves. Thorne will crush her." Their laughter wasn't loud, but it was sharp, slicing through Susan's chest like a blade. She stood behind Abigail, wringing her hands, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might betray her. Elias attacked quickly. His knights leapt forward, bishop slicing across the board, his queen looming early. He moved with the swagger of someone who believed his opponent unworthy of subtlety. Abigail responded differently. She played quietly, tucking pieces into place, moving pawns with deliberate patience. To the untrained eye, her moves looked timid, even clumsy. But to someone watching closely, there was a rhythm, defensive, disciplined, waiting. "Too slow," Elias taunted, capturing one of her knights with his bishop. He leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting with mock triumph. "The battlefield rewards boldness, girl. Hesitation kills." Abigail said nothing. She slid another pawn forward, her face unreadable. The room buzzed with smug laughter. "Poor Susan," one guest whispered, "loses her job because her daughter thought she could play with the grown-ups." Another added cruelly, "Perhaps Thorne will give her a coin for her trouble." Susan's face flushed with humiliation, but her daughter didn't waver. Abigail's eyes remained locked on the board, her lips pressed into a thin line of focus. Piece by piece, Elias grew reckless. His rook stormed down the file, snapping up pawns like soldiers clearing a trench. His queen darted across the center, forcing Abigail into tighter corners. She sacrificed pieces, letting them fall as if they meant nothing. The crowd sneered louder with every capture. "Hopeless," someone laughed. "She's being dismantled." But inside Abigail's mind, her grandfather's voice whispered, "The pawn is never useless. The pawn is the quiet soldier who waits for its moment. Protect them, guide them, and one day they will surprise the whole board." Elias leaned forward again, his tone rising with arrogance. "Do you know what it means to command an army?" he barked. "It means knowing when to strike without mercy, like this." He slammed his queen across the board, capturing one of Abigail's pawns with a flourish. The guests clapped at the theatricality of it. Abigail finally looked up at him. Her voice was soft, but carried. "My grandfather told me something different." Elias snorted. "And what would a shopkeeper know about war?" Abigail placed her hand on another pawn and moved it forward, slow, steady. That sometimes victory belongs not to the strongest, but to the most patient. The laughter dimmed slightly. There was something in the way she said it, something that unsettled even those who had been eager for her defeat. Elias sneered, but pressed on, launching attack after attack, convinced that the girl's pieces were crumbling. Yet the board told a quieter story. Though she had lost material, Abigail's pawns crept forward one by one, almost unnoticed. They were ordinary, small, disposable in the eyes of the arrogant. But in her hands, they were a tide, inching toward the other side. Susan saw it too. Her breath caught as realization dawned. Abigail wasn't flailing, she was weaving. Every sacrifice had a purpose. Every retreat was a step toward something unseen. But Elias didn't notice. He was too busy basking in the chuckles of his audience, too consumed by the thrill of domination to realize the ground beneath him was shifting. And so the conflict sharpened. The titan of war and wealth against the maid's daughter, her fragile army of pawns quietly marching toward destiny. Abigail sat across from Elias Thorne, her small frame barely filling the chair. her hand poised delicately over the board. To those watching, she seemed silent, expressionless, almost doll-like. But inside her mind, memories stirred, memories of her grandfather Frank Miller, whose voice lived in every move she made. Frank had been more than a grandfather. He had been her teacher, her anchor. A wiry man with kind eyes, he had owned a small general store in town, a place that smelled of wood shavings, paper, and cinnamon. The shop was simple but honest, built on relationships and trust. Frank had lived by one rule: integrity above all else. But decades earlier, when Elias Thorne was building his empire, one of his military contracts had spun into a predatory business deal. A supplier went under, prices collapsed, and Frank's store was caught in the fallout. He lost everything, not because of incompetence, but because he had trusted men who valued power more than fairness. Frank never spoke Thorne's name to Abigail, but she had heard the whispers from her mother Susan, who knew the truth. What Frank did share with Abigail was chess. He would set the board on their worn kitchen table, light flickering against the pieces, and say, "This game is life, Abby. It teaches you how to fight with what looks small. Even pawns, the ones people mock, have the power to transform." Abigail had been only 6 when she first touched the pieces, but she absorbed every lesson. Frank taught her not just openings and endings, but patience. "Don't rush for glory," he'd say, moving a pawn with care. "Wait. Let the other side think they're winning. Then when they've overreached, you show them the truth." When Frank passed away, his wooden chessboard became Abigail's treasure. She carried his wisdom like a lantern in the dark. Tonight, under the blinding lights of Thorne's Hall, she played not for herself alone, but for him, for the dignity stripped from her family long before she was born. Meanwhile, Elias Thorne's past sat heavy in the room, though few recognized it. Once a soldier in his prime, he had clawed his way up from nothing, forging a fortune through risk and ruthlessness. The battlefield had taught him that mercy was weakness, and the stock market had rewarded that creed tenfold. To his admirers, he was a hero, a man who had turned scars into symbols of triumph. But to those who had suffered under his shadow, he was a reminder that victories for one man often meant devastation for another. Elias saw none of this tonight. To him, the girl across the board was just a curiosity, a child foolish enough to wander into his arena. He remembered commanding battalions, moving men like pieces on a map. Chess was his game, the perfect echo of war. He did not notice that his aggression mirrored every mistake Frank had once warned Abigail about: overconfidence, haste, blindness to the small details that mattered most. As Elias boasted, Abigail remembered Frank's favorite story, the time he had lost half his pieces to a flashy opponent, but still won with a single pawn. She recalled how he had smiled and said, "Abby, never fear sacrifice. Sometimes giving up the big pieces is how you win the bigger battle." She tightened her grip on the pawn she had just advanced. It looked weak, insignificant. The guests in the hall snickered at her choice, but Frank's words echoed in her ear. "This little soldier can become a queen if you believe in it." Her mother's story lived there too. Susan, who had endured humiliation in silence, who had scrubbed Thorne's marble floors while raising Abigail alone. Susan's eyes tonight were filled with fear, but also something deeper: hope that her daughter would do what she never could: stand tall against the man who had cast such a long shadow over their family. The clash of past and present hung over the board. Elias played as though commanding troops, sacrificing pawns like fodder, thrusting rooks and knights forward without caution. Abigail played as her grandfather had taught her, slow, deliberate, protecting her pawns, building a shape invisible to everyone else. Every move was more than a strategy. It was memory. It was vengeance, tempered with patience. It was a child carrying the lessons of the dead against the arrogance of the living, and though the guests could not see it yet, history itself was aligning on the board. The sins of Elias Thorne's past were about to meet the wisdom of Frank Miller's legacy in the hands of a 9-year-old girl with the calm of a queen and the heart of a pawn. The game stretched on, and the room grew restless. At first, the guests had laughed at Abigail's quiet, defensive play, but now their voices dimmed. Something in the rhythm of the board had shifted. Elias Thorne still attacked with the swagger of a general, his queen slicing across the board, his rooks thundering down open files. Yet each strike seemed to meet a wall of invisible resistance. The girl's pieces, though few, held ground with a stubborn precision that unsettled even the most confident onlookers. Elias leaned back in his chair, lips curled into a smirk. "You've lasted longer than I thought, child, but patience doesn't win wars. Boldness does." With a flourish, he lunged his queen forward, offering her as bait in a dramatic sacrifice. The crowd gasped. "He's setting the trap," someone whispered. Elias's eyes gleamed. He could already see victory. But Abigail did not falter. She studied the board for a long moment, her face calm, her small fingers resting on the piece she would move. Then she captured the queen. Gasps rippled through the room again, not for the move itself, but for the quiet certainty with which she made it. Elias frowned. He had expected hesitation, panic. Instead, the girl looked as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. "Foolish," he muttered, masking unease with bravado. "You've opened yourself wide." He pushed forward, believing the game still his to command. But Abigail's pawns, those humble, overlooked pieces, had been advancing quietly, almost invisibly, throughout the match. One had slipped past the chaos, inching forward each turn like a soldier marching through smoke. Now, as Elias lunged in desperation, Abigail placed her hand on that pawn and nudged it into the final rank. The wooden piece transformed into a queen. A stunned silence fell. The crowd leaned forward, eyes wide. A second queen now stood beside Abigail's army. Elias's face went pale, the blood draining from his cheeks. He finally saw it. The trap had not been his, but hers. The guests began to murmur, some in awe, some in disbelief. "She planned it all along. That pawn, I never noticed it. The old man's done." Elias slammed a fist onto the table, rattling the pieces. "Impossible!" he barked. But even he knew the truth. His arrogance had blinded him. His pride had handed her the board. Abigail looked up at him, her voice soft but firm. "My grandfather taught me, never ignore the smallest piece. It may carry the whole game." The hall fell utterly quiet. Elias Thorne, the war hero, the tycoon, the man who mocked a maid, sat speechless. For the first time in years, his power had been broken, not by a rival general or a cunning investor, but by a 9-year-old girl with a pawn and patience. The turning point had come. Victory now belonged to Abigail Miller. Elias Thorne's hand trembled above the board. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning for salvation among the scattered pieces. His queen was gone, his attack blunted, and across from him, Abigail's second queen loomed like a shadow of inevitability. The guests leaned closer, their jewels glittering in the chandelier's light, their laughter gone. No one dared speak. The only sound was the tick of the antique clock on the mantel and the faint rhythmic scrape of Abigail's small fingers sliding a piece into place. Elias tried to mask his panic with bluster. "Beginner's luck," he scoffed, his voice cracking. "The tide can still turn." He lunged with his rook, a desperate counterattack that left his backline exposed. Abigail barely moved her face. She shifted her new queen into position with the calm precision of a surgeon. Her pawns, once ignored, now stood like a wall across the center, protecting her progress. Her bishops cut through diagonals like watchful hawks, hemming Elias's king into a shrinking cage. Each of his moves grew wilder, less controlled. He pushed his knights forward recklessly, swung his rooks side to side as if brute force could undo patience. Abigail responded with elegance, trading piece for piece only when it tightened the noose. She was not playing to impress. She was playing to end the war. Sweat beaded along Elias's forehead. He remembered commanding men in jungles and deserts, barking orders with certainty. Back then, he believed victory was his birthright, carved into his bones. But tonight, across from a girl barely old enough to climb into the chair, he felt something he had not felt since those darkest days. Fear. Susan stood frozen behind her daughter, hands clasped to her mouth. She could hardly breathe. The memory of Frank Miller pulsed through her. Her father, who had once played chess at that same kitchen table, telling her that pawns were not to be underestimated. She realized now that his lesson had passed into Abigail, alive in her steady eyes. The endgame came swiftly. Abigail advanced her second queen in tandem with the first, pinning Elias's rook. His king stumbled across the board, but there was nowhere left to go. Her bishops carved the diagonals. Her pawns sealed the escape. At last, Abigail lifted one queen, her hand so small it seemed almost fragile, and set it down with a quiet click. Checkmate! The word echoed through the hall like a verdict. Gasps erupted. A woman dropped her wineglass. A man muttered, "Unbelievable!" The air was thick with disbelief, awe, and shame. For the first time in his long life, Elias Thorne sat on the losing side of a game he thought beneath him. His face drained of color. His chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. Abigail leaned back in her chair, her expression still calm, as if she had merely finished her homework. Her eyes lifted to his, not mocking, not gloating, just steady. "You promised," she said softly. The reminder cut deeper than any insult. Elias's boastful words, "Win this and I'll give you $100 million," now stood in the silence, binding him. The room turned on him, dozens of eyes demanding he honor his wager. For a moment, Elias looked as though he might refuse. His fists clenched on the table, knuckles white, jaw tight. He could deny her, laugh it off as a child's game. But in that instant, something broke inside him. He saw not just Abigail, but Frank Miller's ghost in her composure, and behind her, Susan's weary dignity. He remembered the deals, the contracts, the greed that had destroyed small men like Frank. He had dismissed them as pawns once. Now one of those pawns had become his queen. His cane slipped from his hand and clattered against the floor. Slowly, painfully, Elias rose to his feet. The room hushed as he turned to the guests, his voice hoarse. I made a promise, and I will keep it." He looked down at Abigail, his arrogance stripped bare. "The 100 million is yours, but money alone won't erase what I've done. It never could." Susan gasped. Abigail's small fingers tightened on the edge of the table, but she said nothing. Elias continued, his voice cracking. "From this night forward, a fund will be created in your name, Abigail Miller. It will support families ruined by war and by men like me. It will help those I once ignored. That is my true payment." The guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one laughed. No one dared. They had witnessed the undoing of a titan, not by force, but by the quiet brilliance of a child. Abigail rose from her chair, her eyes never leaving his. "Then make it mean something," she said. The hall fell silent again. Elias Thorne, who had once commanded armies and fortunes, bowed his head to a 9-year-old girl, the maid's daughter, who had beaten him at his own game. The climax had arrived. The king had fallen, and the pawn had become queen. The glittering hall, once a theater of Elias Thorne's dominance, now felt like a courtroom. His guests, investors, retired officers, socialites, no longer leaned toward him with admiration. They whispered instead, eyes wide, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief and disdain. The man who had built an empire on victories now sat defeated before a child. His cane rested against the floor, his hands trembling slightly as if the strength that had carried him through wars and boardrooms had evaporated in the span of one game. For years, Elias had believed respect was won through fear and fortune. Tonight, both had abandoned him. The people in the room who once clung to his every word now looked to Abigail, the little girl who had checkmated him, as though she were the true sovereign of the moment. He tried to laugh it off at first, his voice brittle. A clever trick. The girl got lucky. But the words sounded hollow, even to him. His guests exchanged glances, unimpressed. One whispered, "He can't even admit it." Another shook his head, murmuring, "All these years, and arrogance is still his only armor." The realization struck Elias harder than the loss itself. In his pride, he had become what he once despised, a man who mistook cruelty for strength, who crushed the small because he could. Frank Miller's ghost seemed to stand in the corner, reminding him of debts unpaid. His downfall was not only the loss of a wager or a fortune, it was the collapse of the myth he had built around himself. In that hall, stripped of triumph, Elias saw himself through Abigail's calm, unblinking eyes, and he did not like what he saw. The guests began to drift toward Susan and Abigail, offering words of admiration, even apologies for their earlier mockery. No one approached Elias. No one sought his approval. The circle he once commanded now belonged to the maid's daughter. He lowered his head, shoulders heavy, the fall of a general, of a magnate, of a king. And yet, somewhere in the ache of humiliation, a spark flickered. Perhaps the girl had not only beaten him, but offered him the rarest gift, an invitation to change. The night ended not with champagne or laughter, but with a quiet shift no one could deny. The guests left the Thorne estate murmuring of what they had seen, the fall of a titan, the rise of a child, and a lesson too sharp to forget. Abigail stood beside her mother, her small hand wrapped around Susan's. She was tired but steady, her eyes bright, with something greater than victory, purpose. Susan bent down and whispered, "Your grandfather would be so proud." Abigail smiled faintly, clutching the memory of Frank Miller like a metal pinned to her heart. Elias remained in the hall after the last guest departed, alone with the board that had undone him. The pieces still lay where Abigail had left them, his king cornered, the two queens looming over it. He stared at them for a long time. For decades, he had believed himself invincible, untouchable. But tonight, a 9-year-old had shown him what no general, no rival, no fortune had ever forced him to see. Power without compassion was hollow. The next morning, true to his word, Elias announced the creation of the Miller Fund, $100 million dedicated to small businesses and families scarred by conflict. His lawyers balked, his investors panicked, but Elias did not flinch. "This is not charity," he told them. "It is debt, and it is time I paid it." Over the months that followed, Abigail visited him often. Their relationship was not one of master and pupil, but of unlikely equals. He taught her about markets, strategy, and discipline. She taught him patience, humility, and the quiet strength of pawns. They argued, they laughed, and slowly, Elias's iron pride softened into something closer to wisdom. Years later, the hall that had once echoed with his arrogance hosted a very different scene. Abigail, now a young woman, stood before a crowd of veterans and entrepreneurs announcing new grants from the Miller Fund. Elias sat in the front row, his cane across his lap, watching with a pride he no longer disguised. When she finished her speech, she glanced at him, and for once he bowed his head, not in defeat, but in respect. The pawn had crossed the board. She was no longer the maid's daughter who dared to challenge a king. She had become the queen of her own destiny, carrying forward a legacy of compassion and fairness. And Elias Thorne, humbled yet renewed, had finally learned how to play a better game.